Camas Books in Victoria, British Columbia is a center for information on anarchism, anti-capitalism, and anti-colonialism. An appropriate venue for author, activist, and artist Gord Hill. He wrote and drew the 500 Years of Indigenous Resistance comic book, which expands and updates his black and white version published more than a decade ago. The history focuses on the violent efforts to destroy indigenous peoples and their cultures, and the fierce resistance of those First Nations. As he noted to a gathering at Camas Books and to others at the First Peoples House at the University of Victoria, the assaults on the Indigenous are still taking place.
Today, I think up in the Wet'suwet'en territory, they're being raided by the RCMP. I haven't been able to update myself, but I mean, so this stuff's really ongoing.
XRTV Victoria asked Gord Hill about the past and the present in an extended interview. One of the things that's really striking is how consistently the invasion of North America has been violent. And I think that it's very rare when the graphic nature of the slaughter of Indigenous people is presented. Did that motivate you in any way when you were coloring, when you were drawing, and when you were writing this book?
To a certain extent, because with the colonial history, there's different narratives, and sometimes it portrays Indigenous people as being helpless victims of this genocide, and that they were just like steamrolled by these European colonial powers. And in that context, there's certainly a lot of violence. But on the other hand, there's another narrative where it was a mutually beneficial process for Indigenous people and European nations, that this meeting of two worlds type of thing. But I think for the most part, the violent aspect of colonization is kind of minimized or even erased. And so I did want to include that in the comic or in the graphic novel, because it's an important part of the history, the violence that occurred and that's still occurring today.
What did that do to you as the author and artist to have to immerse yourself in those particular details?
I think when I first started doing a lot of this type of research with the first edition, researching a lot of the history was more of a struggle, because I was encountering like some of the historical accounts were like quite racist, and I mean some of them are centuries old, and so like this white supremacy was just the norm, and that's how the authors talked, and they really degraded Indigenous people. So that was hard to go through at first, but because I've been doing it for so many years, now researching and coming across these types of accounts, it doesn't really faze me as much. So I guess I've become more accustomed to it.
Was working in color and working with more sophisticated tools that you've acquired, did that make it easier for you to work with the violence or more difficult?
I think it made it more easier because I could portray it like more graphically with showing the blood when people are getting cut with swords and whatnot, to kind of add that edge to the comic, and not like minimize it. It's kind of a fine line between you want to show some of the graphic violence, but then you don't want it to be too overwhelming, because I want the comic to be accessible to young people and to adults as well. So I mean, I could have showed much more of this kind of graphic violence. So I kind of tried to balance it between showing it, but not engaging too much in it.
I think you really hit that balance very well. I asked Gord to look at a panel portraying a Mayan woman and her baby. This is just a beautiful, beautiful piece of work. It's very touching. And I wanted to ask you what inspired you, if you can recall. I realize you've drawn many, many panels, but if you can recall what inspired you to draw that woman and her child.
It's to show that the Maya still live and practice their culture. They still have their textiles and their traditional ways that they've maintained for centuries since colonization. And I put the red outline around it to kind of really put the woman and her child in the foreground, to really emphasize them. And I put the land in the background to show the landscape that that their society lived in. And I just wanted to show the continuation through the generations, and so it's a mother with her child that the Maya are still going to continue on.
Now, if you turn to the next page, page 42, there's the Maya women warriors. Let's talk about the women warriors.
Well, I had some criticism of the first edition that there was very few women portrayed, and because I had focused more on the military aspect of colonization and anti-colonial resistance, and for the most part, a lot of Indigenous nations, the primary warriors, the ones who went to fight, were men. But when I was looking into it and researching more, a lot of Indigenous nations actually had women who participated in the combat. So I definitely wanted to highlight that. And because today in our Indigenous resistance movements, women are often at the forefront and on the front lines of these struggles.
When you say today, it is literally today. When we look at Molly Wickham Slato in the Wet'suwet'en territory, for instance, she's out front and a very strong presence.
Yeah, and I mean, traditionally in a lot of Indigenous societies, women had very prominent leadership roles in the community, and that's something that, because of the patriarchal nature of this colonial system that we've become contained within, it's always erased, and that was the main reason why I wanted to include much more the women's participation in this anti-colonial resistance.
Author, activist, and artist Gord Hill also talked about other contrasts between Indigenous peoples and the Europeans who invaded their lands.
What we have, in the 15th century was these feudal kingdoms engaging in these ongoing power struggles and seeking out new lands and resources, because Europe was basically like a dying entity at that time, with overpopulation, a lot of poverty, disease epidemics. And so the colonization of the Americas really enriched Europe and revitalized it and gave it a new life, because they were taking all the gold and silver and all these other resources, and all of this was being shipped back to Europe to, as part of the revitalization of Europe.
Gord notes that a critical component of colonization and control was the imposition of Christianity on Indigenous peoples.
And the residential schools were definitely a big part of that in North America, because they would take the children and deny them access to their culture and prohibit them from speaking their language, and basically impose the European culture onto them. So it's a very important part of colonization, because that's how you control the surviving population, and that's what we've ended up with today.
What are you seeing and hearing among your contemporaries and your elders regarding their attitudes towards Christianity, Catholicism?
Well, I think it's kind of like a generational gap, because you have the generations that went through the residential school, and a lot of them were Christianized. So we have a lot of elders that are actually very Christianized. And some of them still practice traditional cultures, but they have this a Christian overview that they've incorporated into their traditional beliefs. But with the younger generation, you have a much stronger, I think, rejection of Christianity, and they're not as interested in this religion. And I think you can say that's kind of happened overall in Western society. There's been a decline of the church and religion and stuff, except maybe in the United States, where you have a very strong Christian right wing. But I think overall, the younger generation isn't really into that, and if they're thinking about stuff like that, they're actually turning more to their traditional culture and spirituality. So I think there's kind of a generational gap. Yeah.
How about you?
I have no interest in Christianity, and I never did as a child. And it was once I became involved in the Indigenous social movements and resistance, and that's when I started to participate in more traditional culture and ceremonies and stuff like that.
Gord says a pivotal political moment for him and many Indigenous activists came in the 1990 Oka crisis.
Well, Oka is a small town in Quebec. It's located next to Kanesatake, which is a Mohawk territory or reserve. And in 1990, the municipality of Oka wanted to expand a golf course and build a condominium project. And they wanted to remove this section of a pine forest. And it was a really important area for the Mohawks of Kanesatake, and they also had a burial ground there. So they were opposed to the expansion of the golf course and the construction of the condominium, so they began protesting and getting petitions and trying to convince the municipal government not to go through with this. And the mayor of Oka was adamant. He was like, "No, we're gonna do this expansion and whatnot." So the Mohawks of Ganasatagi sent out runners to different Mohawk or communities of the Haudenosaunee, known as the Six Nations Iroquois Confederacy, and so warriors responded to that, and they went to Ganasatagi, and they set up a small roadblock on a dirt road that wasn't really used at all. But the Quebec provincial government decided that they were gonna, end this, and they sent in a large police force, including heavily armed tactical units. And on July 11th, 1990, there was the police went in to try to remove that blockade, but they encountered armed resistance, and there was a shootout. A police officer was shot and killed, and it began a 77-day armed standoff, initially with a couple thousand police, and then after that, after a couple of weeks, the Canadian military was deployed. They deployed a mechanized infantry brigade, about 5,000 soldiers, with armored personnel carriers and tanks, and they had Air Force and naval support as well. And this standoff went on all through the summer of 1990, and it was a huge historical event. It set the tone for Indigenous resistance all through the 1990s and even up until today. When you see what's called the Mohawk warrior flag, that came out of Oka 1990, and so it was a very, very important conflict or confrontation in Canada, and it really reawakened kind of like the warrior spirit of Indigenous peoples, and it really re-energized Indigenous resistance throughout the country. It was a victory because the condominiums were never built and the golf course was never expanded. The thing about Oka for me was because I'd been in the military actually for about 5 years. I was in Army Cadets in the Army Reserve, and that was going to be my career. I was going to join the Canadian Armed Forces. So I had this military training, and when I became involved in the radical movements and anarchist movements, I was a militant from the beginning. I saw militant tactics and militant direct actions as something that you engage in as a resistance movement against the state. And Oka, what Oka did was it really inspired me to see Indigenous people engaging in this level of resistance.
It is striking to me as an outsider to see the confluence between elements of anarchism and elements of indigeneity. What do you think of that?
I think there is some common overlap because in many ways, a lot of Indigenous societies are kind of organized, they self-organize themselves in kind of like autonomous, decentralized manners. I mean, our villages were basically autonomous entities that could enter into war or trade on their own. Even though you have a nation of maybe like 20 or 30 villages that form that Indigenous nation because they share a similar language and the territory and culture and history. But each village was autonomous, and even in the village, and we have hereditary leaders, like hereditary chiefs they're called, and that's based on ancestry, the family lineage, and so these positions are hereditary. But even these high-ranking people, as we refer to them as high-ranking people, they didn't really have the type of power and authority that you might think of as in the European form of social organization. They couldn't necessarily command people to go and do this or do that. They had to exercise a type of leadership that inspired and motivated people to follow a course of action. So it wasn't this authoritarian hierarchy. And so that, I think, is somewhat similar to anarchist forms of self-organizing, where you have no hierarchy and or institutionalized structures as such. I mean, on the Northwest Coast, it's a little different because we do have kind of like a hierarchy in terms of how people are ranked based on their lineage from the first ancestor. But even in that context, like these hereditary leaders, they just do not have the power and authority to command people. And so I think that's kind of like part of the parallels or whatever between Indigenous culture and anarchist culture and forms of organizing. And I think that's why you see a lot of anarchist solidarity with indigenous movements today. And I think anarchists are a really strong part of the solidarity movements that arise when indigenous peoples are engaging in a big struggle. Yeah, anarchists are often at the forefront.
No coincidence then that you had your book event at Camas Bookstore in Victoria.
Yeah, because they've always been really supportive and acting in solidarity with indigenous peoples. So yeah, definitely.
Gord says it's going to become critical for people to organize as communities in the next 5 to 10 years.
If you look at like doomsday preppers, I mean, these are mostly white Americans that are preparing, and their society and the culture that's really strong and dominant there is very individualistic, which is a product of the capitalist system. Capitalist society wants everybody to be isolated individuals because then they're always buying stuff and they rely on the system and consumerism to meet their needs. So anyway, these doomsday preppers, like they're all about their own little nuclear family and or as an individual entity. How are they going to survive the apocalypse? And so they rely on being heavily armed and stockpiling all this food and defending it against anybody else who comes into their area. But I think the way people are really going to survive any kind of massive systemic changes is with community, because you need the community to survive. And that's how people have survived for tens of thousands of years, is not as a small little group, it's as a community, as a nation. That's how indigenous nations have survived for many thousands of years, is because they were a community. And it takes a community to gather those resources and to maintain them. Things like community gardens and building shelters and raising families and all that stuff, it takes community to do that. And resilient communities are the key to survival in the future, definitely.
Going back to the comic book, I was really struck by the Mapuche. Talk to us about that, because when you talk about resistance, man, did they resist.
Yeah, I think they were one of the most successful anti-colonial resistance movements that existed in the Americas. And like I like to compare them to the Aztec and the Inca, which were these massive empires with millions of subjects and hundreds of thousands of warriors that they could deploy, but they were fairly quickly overcome by the Spanish. With the case of the Aztec or the Mexica, Cortez was able to basically kidnap the emperor and decapitate the empire, and also exploit the divisions that empires always have, because the empire is held together by force of arms because they'd conquered these surrounding nations. And the Mapuche, because they're autonomous and decentralized, they were able to just adopt much more quickly new tactics, and so they devised their own armor, very thick leather armor that was kind of modeled after this Spanish conquistador armor. And so the Mapuche developed their own pike formation with these very long lances that they could form a formation that would stop a cavalry charge. And then they also got horses, and they were able to create their own cavalry force, which over time was actually able to challenge and defeat the Spanish cavalry. But even today, the Mapuche are a very strong resistance movement in Chile, and they still face a lot of state repression, but they still engage in these like very militant land defense campaigns. And they're like the star of the comic book, I would say. Like they're the highlight of this indigenous resistance to show the capability of what you can achieve.